Different by design. Studebaker is. Studebaker is. Studebaker is.
Well, without further ado, we'd like to introduce a great friend of the museum, a friend of mine, Mary Seelhorst. Let's learn a little more about the Aston Martin from Goldfinger.
Okay. All right. I'm going to put this thing on so I don't have to deal with it. So, Andy obviously knows me far too well. I apologize for that introduction. About half of it was true. So, not the rhubarb part. Anyway, so just to continue so I know who the audience is, how many of you have seen the 1964 movie Goldfinger? Ooh, just about everybody, yay. So how many of you have seen every single Bond movie? That would be me too. Does anyone know how many there are? 38. 38. I didn't believe it until I counted them. There are 38. So if you now how many have watched all of them more than once? So
including the original Casino.
yes, sure. So yeah, I think if that's like an entire 2+ work weeks of your life. So congratulations. So this is a story about the Goldfinger car, or more accurately, several cars that together created the illusion that there is one Aston Martin DB5 created by Q in 1964 and stashed away for occasional redeployment over the last 60 years. Now this story is partly personal. I mean, I did have the keys in my pocket for one brief moment back in 1997, but mostly this is a professional story for me. As Andy said, I'm an independent museum exhibit developer, and I work on lots of automotive museums. The DB5 story is the most interesting and convoluted story about provenance that I have ever encountered. Now this recent article from a really interesting magazine called Rare and Unique Vehicles, it says, the little blurb up there, it says, that the Goldfinger car is, quote, perhaps the most famous provenance. But then the author never explains it at all. So I guess it's up to me. So let's go. Now, even if you already knew that the original tricked out Aston Martin DB5 used in Goldfinger and Thunderball was stolen and never recovered, you're going to hear some things today that you haven't heard before because I have some new information that hasn't even hit the streets yet. And no, it has not been found. They keep saying, oh, maybe it's been spotted, maybe it's been seen, maybe it's in Saudi Arabia. It has not been found. So pre-Goldfingering, the original contraption-covered star car, which is my name for the original gadget car, it began life in 1962 as a 5th series DB4. Aston Martin re-engineered it as the DB5 prototype and then used it as a test mule. So after a lot of cajoling, Aston Martin agreed to loan the mule to Eon Productions to be modified for Goldfinger because the movie company at that time couldn't afford the 4,500 pounds to buy one. So imagine Eon Productions of today's Goldfinger fame unable to afford to buy a car. But that was the situation. So you can tell it from the other ones because that first car had the telltale side marker lights. You see it right there? And you'll start noticing that in some other images that because this was originally a DB4, it has that side marker light and none of the other ones do. In fact, this car, this Aston Martin product brochure featured that very car. It was originally painted red. So this very car in this picture was delivered to Pinewood Studios in England in January 1964, where the special effects master, John Steers, whipped it like a rented mule. I'm sorry, but I had to make the joke. So, after Steers' crew added 300 pounds of defensive and offensive weaponry, quadrupling the car's sticker price and halving its agility, the director decided they needed a stand-in for the fast driving scenes. So enter another loaner, the stunt car, which is a production DB5 with none of Q's minor modifications that made the movie car so memorable. It also did not have the side marker lights. So when Goldfinger opened in September 1964, the car itself was an instant hit. Aston Martin was flooded with requests for the DB5 to appear at events, so the company decided to double its publicity options. As soon as the stunt car completed its scenes for Thunderball, seen here, it went under the knife and emerged with faux fighting finery nearly identical to the original. And you see, this is the stunt car. It does not have the side marker lights. So they slice, they dice. But wait, there's more. The success of Goldfinger meant that Eon Productions could afford to buy its own cars. So for the Thunderball premiere in 1965, Eon commissioned 2 more tarted-up DB5s for the US publicity tour. So a fleet of 4 Bondmobiles could now blanket the globe, brandishing enough working weapons to thwart any evil scheme. In 1968, in one of the more boneheaded moves in Autodom, an anonymous Aston Martin functionary decided to strip the star car of all the movie gags, spiff it up a bit, and sell it as a used car. 1 year later, the buyer, Gavin Kazar, noticed that the other supposedly lesser but still tricked out Bond cars were being passed off as the real thing and selling for high prices. So he installed similar weapons of his own design onto the star car in an effort to pump up its value. So yes, the original car had all the gadgets stripped off, and this guy made his own and installed them. So let's take stock. By 1970, we have the original DB4 cum DB5 prototype, the star of 2 movies, its gadgetry amputated and later replaced with prosthetics. We have a production DB5, the one on the top right here, driven like hell in 2 movies and surgically altered afterward to resemble the original. Because remember that the driver did not have any of the gadgets. Then we have 2 DB5s never used in the movies. Those are the 2 at the top left. But they had all the gadgets in all the right places. So talk about a provenance nightmare. All the cars had some element of authenticity, but varying degrees of originality. So is there a there? Does anybody care? Well, the public didn't, and it still doesn't seem to care. Enjoying a Bond film requires suspension of disbelief, shall we say. And Bond fans seem willing to jettison their disbelief like ejecting an unwanted passenger. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, some of this isn't going to make sense. So as long as the car sitting in front of the fans emits enough Bond aura, as well as oil and smoke and tax and evildoers, they're happy. The car's owners, though, certainly cared, and they were not amused. A 1981 Wall Street Journal article chronicled the battle among 3 of the 4 cars' owners, Jerry Lee, Richard Losey, and Frank Baker, all of whom claimed they had the Bond car, by which they meant the numero uno star car, the DB4 that became the DB5. And I apologize for the quality of some of these, but over the years, sometimes all I have is an old Xerox or something somebody faxed me. So some of these images aren't going to be as nice as others. So the prize for these guys, determining who had the original, was not just a matter of pride, but also of money, assuming that the Bond car was more valuable than a Bond car. So Jerry Lee finally asked Aston Martin to authenticate which car was which. In sort of a reverse Solomon splitting the baby move, the company identified them by their chassis numbers and finally settled the dispute. So Richard Losey was the winner with the star car. Lee came in second with the stunt car, and tied for third with the PR cars were Frank Baker and the Smoky Mountain Car Museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, which had not entered the fray over which car was which. And I actually saw the car that they had. I stopped there many, many, many years ago. They had it in a cage, literally like a chain link fence was built around the car, very close to it. And I think it was actually like floor to ceiling, but it was this dark weird room just jammed full of stuff, and here's one of the Bond cars sitting there. It was remarkable. And I wish I'd taken a photo of it, but I didn't. So despite the clarification about which car was which, many questions remained, at least in the minds of true Bond maniacs. Some of you might even be in here. The history trail was so faint that Dave Worrell of Great Britain spent 6 years of his life getting the cars straight for his 1991 book, The Most Famous Car in the World, The Complete History of the Bond Aston Martin DB5. So to him, I'm indebted for a lot of the minor modification minutiae presented here. But wait, there's still more. Where Worrell's book leaves off, in 1991, another tale begins. Worrell's last chapter includes a photo of Richard Losey, the guy that we just saw, who owned the original car. He's the guy in the light jacket in the top left. He's handing the Star Car's keys to Robert Luongo, the guy with the beard. Now, Luongo had just placed the $275,000 winning bid for the car at a Sotheby's auction in 1986. He was acting as an agent for the car's new owner, a Florida real estate developer and avid pop culture collector, Anthony Puglisi III. So Puglisi was and still is a somewhat shady character, and yes, he's originally from New Jersey. To him, I didn't mean anything by that. To him, the DB5 was just another score for his collection, which included things like John Lennon's white suit from the Beatles' Abbey Road album, and the gun that Jack Ruby used to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald. He also had Harry Houdini's wooden crate from which Houdini escaped after being bound in chains and submerged. So Puglisi had no qualms about using or risking damage to these objects, and I could tell you some more stories about that, but we'd be here all day. So Luongo, this guy here, also known as Puglisi's brother-in-law, began an aggressive campaign to promote the car. He placed it at dozens of museums, auto shows, and other venues, carefully documenting each exhibition. Now, this is an example of his documentation. He put little stickers on the top of them and then identified, what the publicity was from or where the car was shown. And he gave me copies of some of this, so that's how I ended up with some of these things. So his documentation was used as evidence of the car's perceived value during efforts to increase the car's insurance in 1993. So in 93, the insurance was bumped up to $1 million. In 1994, it was bumped up to $3 million. Grundy Worldwide, an insurance agency specializing in classic cars, was the agent for at least the last 2 insurance bumps and maybe more. We're still not quite sure about that. So in 1996, armed with a new $4.2 million appraisal, Puglisi asked Jim Grundy to increase the insurance yet again. Jim accepted the appraisal and executed a policy with Chubb Insurance for $4.2 million for that car in that picture there. Now, so far, everything that I've told you, to the best of my knowledge, is true. The next part of the story is as it was told to me by Jim Grundy, the insurance agent, which I believe to be true back in 2006 when I wrote this article for Motor Trend Classic. That was a great magazine. It's now, Motor Trends is still in existence, but Motor Trend Classic is defunct. But I wrote a story about this whole thing. So I'm going to tell you the story as it appears in this article, and I'll correct the record afterward. So one night in June 1997, the car was stolen from the Boca Raton airport hangar where it was stored. The thieves tore a gate off its hinges with a truck and a chain, cut the hangar's alarm wires, wrapped the chain around the DB5's axle, and dragged it out of the storage bay. Skid marks ended where a light cargo plane was probably parked. Planes small enough to use an airport that size have limited range, so the Boca Raton police and Chubb immediately checked all airports within range to see if any vehicle had been offloaded or transferred that night, but they found nothing. So that's the end of the alternative facts portion. So the crime to this day remains unsolved, but finding no evidence that the car was transferred from a plane isn't the same as finding evidence that it was dumped in the ocean or something else. So then there's the question of motive for this theft. The immediately obvious one, insurance fraud, wasn't the only possibility. By then, Robert Longo and Anthony Puglisi were no longer brothers-in-law, and they had been at odds about how to deal with the car. Was it jealousy? Was it revenge? Was it spite? Was it a simple car theft where the thieves didn't realize they had a famous car and dumped it when they realized they couldn't fence it? Or was it an unrelated, obsessed collector who stole the car, wanting to stash it in his rec room and stroke it each night before bedtime? Nobody knows. So Chubb Insurance paid Puglisi the $4.2 million that they had just insured the car for. Now, when I interviewed Jim Grundy, the insurance agent, back in 2006 for this article, he recalled the episode with some chagrin. "I used poor judgment in accepting the value," he said. "I give Puglisi some credit for making a shrewd buy, but I made a mistake. $500,000 or $1 million would have protected the investment." So within months, Longo, the guy who was showing the car, sued Puglisi, the owner, for a share of the insurance money. Now, Puglisi countersued, claiming extortion. So a judge jettisoned the countersuit, and Longo v. Puglisi went to trial in the year 2000. Longo's lawyer made the case that his client, who was a Harvard grad, had devoted countless hours to promoting the car without pay based on a verbal agreement with the owner that he'd get 10% of the eventual sale price. So what if the car was stolen rather than sold? Its value had increased from $250,000 to $4.2 million while it was in Longo's care, so he figured he should get a cut, plus 10% of the insurance money. The lawyer argued that the owner, Puglisi, was so far removed from the exhibition efforts that he thought Leslie Kendall, curator at the prestigious Peterson Automotive Museum where the car had been shown, was a woman. And Les thought that was really funny when I told him. So Puglisi's lawyer shot back. Yes, Puglisi had once offered Longo 10% of the car's sales price, but only if Longo sold it within a 6-month window in 1993. And yes, Puglisi didn't pay Longo for his efforts, but that's because Longo was obsessed with the car and wouldn't listen to him and refused to stop promoting it even after Puglisi fired him in 1992. So when Longo kept hounding him about the car, owner Puglisi kindly relented and returned the keys. After all, the two men were family then. So how do I know all the detail about this trial? Well, I was there for all of it. At the request of Robert Longo's lawyer, I was in the courtroom to tell the facts about working with him in 1997 while I was planning and installing an exhibit of the DB5 star car at Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, where I was employed at the time. It was the last time the car was shown in any museum because it was stolen just 3 months after it was returned to Florida. So I think it was at Henry Ford Museum like January through March. It went back to Boca Raton into the airport hangar, and then it was stolen, what did I say, it was June? In the summer, anyway. So I left Henry Ford Museum later that same year in 1997 to become an independent exhibit developer. So coincidentally, when I was asked to do the telephone deposition for the lawsuit in 1999, I was working on an exhibit project for Ford Motor Company, which at the time owned Aston Martin. So that was a little weird. I was actually in a meeting at Ford, and they had to I had to step out of the meeting and go into another room, and they transferred the call from the lawyers, and I did a deposition. So it's the first time I'd ever done that. So I answered questions from both the defendants and the plaintiff's lawyers. Longo's lawyer, Jeffrey Fisher, liked the answer to one question so much that he subpoenaed me as a witness at the trial. And that's facts that I printed out on scrap paper, so I'm sorry, but you can see through to the scrap paper. But that was my subpoena. So when I walked into the Palm Beach County courtroom in April 2000, I half expected to see a sweaty witness strapped to a slab, laser beam inching inexorably crotchward. "Do you expect me to talk?" "No, Ms. Witness, I expect you to die." While the actual trial wasn't as dramatic as a Bond flick, it was a little uncomfortable for me. No one told me I couldn't, so I sat in the back of the courtroom taking notes just in case I ever got a chance to write about this, which I did. When the judge realized what I was doing, I could have sworn she glared at me right through her black eye patch. The white cat she'd been stroking hissed. I feared the witness stand would have a false floor leading to a shark tank, or worse, a tank of lawyers. So the prosecutor asked questions establishing that I had never interacted with Mr. Puglisi, the owner, only with Mr. Luongo, that museum staff would not have known how to deploy the DB5's gadgets without Mr. Luongo's help, and that it was my understanding in 1997 that Mr. Luongo spent several days helping move and display the Aston Martin without pay because he had some kind of monetary interest in the car. The more it was worth, the more he'd get when it was sold or disposed of, stolen, whatever. And I have to pause on this one because that's me. In 1997, we did a Bond-themed party when we opened the exhibit. That is not Robert Luongo. That was my husband at the time, dressed as a Bond villain with the eye patch and his little sharkskin suit. And yeah, sorry about the awful photos, but you know, when it's dark and you have an old Instamatic camera, that's the way they come out. And I was thinking about this earlier, and I am almost 100% sure that Robert Luongo took that picture. He was hovering around the entire evening, and I told him that he couldn't talk to the guests that were there. So he was kind of hanging around and talking to me most of the time, and I think I handed him the camera and told him to shoot it. So anyway, back to the trial. The facts were useful, but what the prosecution really wanted was my opinion, which I had expressed in my earlier phone deposition. So to do that, they had to get me accepted as an expert witness. So the judge asked me a few questions, and I was declared an automobile museum expert, much to my surprise. This was a long time ago. Now I wouldn't be quite so surprised, but back then I was like, wow, they believed me. So Fisher asked me if I thought the Goldfinger Aston Martin DB5 was really the most famous car in the world, like the book says. I said, no. I think the most famous car is the one President Kennedy was riding in when he was assassinated. It's at Henry Ford Museum. Coincidentally, it was about 20 feet from where we had the Bond car displayed. So Fisher asked me why I thought this was the most famous car in the world. And I said, because there's a great unsolved mystery surrounding the event. The car is constantly in the public eye. It's on exhibit. It's in the Zapruder film. It's been in dozens of documentaries, books, and movies. So part of Fisher's argument, as it turns out, was that Luongo's efforts to keep the Goldfinger car visible helped keep the car famous. And in his arithmetic book, famous equals valuable equals profitable when sold or stolen. Take your pick. So the jury, whoa, that's big. The jury deliberated 42 minutes, awarding Luongo just over $1 million. That was 10% of the insurance money, plus half of the $1.2 million uptick in the appraised value of the car that happened in 1996, less attorney's fees and taxes, and the plane ticket for me to come and testify in person. So the theft might have made the remaining cars more valuable, but the value of such cars is hard to calculate for insurance purposes. My Motor Trend Classic article was occasioned by RM Auctions listing the PR car that was owned by the Smoky Mountain Car Museum for sale. And that's why they contacted me and asked if I could write about it. I was good friends with one of the guys on the staff, Frank Marcus, and he had heard me tell the story in the bar. And so he said, didn't you have something to do with that? Why don't you write us an article? So that is the car that was at the Smoky Mountain Car Museum. So Jim Grundy explained to me when I called him, generally you look for comparables. He said, one thing I learned is if you don't have comparables, you have to resort to something more traditional, like what was paid or how much inflation since the purchase. Now, Dave Worrell, the guy who wrote the Most Famous Car in the World book, he thinks that the Star car, the one that got stolen, was actually the least authentic of the four cars movie-wise because its gadgets weren't original. So in my email exchange with him in 2006, he said, the most important aspect of the car's theft is that it was the actual first DB5 prototype built, so it's a great loss for the world of automotive history. And I tend to agree with him on that one. So as I mentioned back in 2006, when I wrote up the Motor Trend Classic, so I was asked to write this story up, for about my involvement with the car. And this article, which is in Motor Trend's online archive, led to other interested people contacting me. So since then, the DB5 story has turned into something of a cottage industry for me. So I was contacted to work on the Spyscape attraction in New York City, which features Bond and the DB5 prominently in its immersive spy-themed experience. I ultimately passed on that because they wanted to include the car's owner, Anthony Puglisi, as a theft suspect in a fake lineup, and he's quite litigious. And I said, I don't think I want to be involved with that. But it was interesting, and I went kind of far with that before I finally backed out of it. So then I was interviewed for an 8-episode podcast called The Great James Bond Car Robbery, narrated by Elizabeth Hurley. Episodes were released leading up to the opening of the most recent Bond movie, No Time to Die, in 2021. Now, oddly, in these episodes, they left out the fact that the stolen car was, or is, the original DB5 prototype. But they did promote the fact that Art Recovery International is offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to its recovery. So last year, I wrote exhibit labels for a temporary exhibit at Chicago Museum of Science and Industry called 007 Science, Inventing the World of James Bond. It's at Chicago right now. You can go see it if you haven't already. I got to go see it this summer, and it was a lot of fun. This is one of the drawings from when we were planning it, and that's a rather bad picture of me standing right about there. It's open only through October 27th, so if you want to see it, you should go soon. So most recently, I was contacted by a filmmaker working on an upcoming documentary series that is in part about the theft of the DB5. I almost turned it down outright because, you do kind of get tired of this after a while. But then I learned that it's actor Danny Huston's project, and it's in part an homage to his father. Now, his father was legendary director John Huston. The documentary explores the power movies have to create a shared modern mythology, which actually, Andy, is the only time my folklore degree has ever come in handy. When they contacted me because they knew I knew about the Bond car, and then he goes, "You're a folklorist? Really?" So, yeah, when you're dealing with movie mythology, I guess being a folklorist is handy. So I knew, though, that John Huston didn't direct any Bond movies, so I had to ask him, what was the connection between John Huston and the DB5? So here we go. John Huston's first film was The Maltese Falcon, which made Humphrey Bogart famous in 1941 as Private Detective Sam Spade. Have any of you seen this? Enough of you? Okay. It turns out that among the pop culture objects that Anthony Puglisi collected was the Maltese Falcon, or I should say a Maltese Falcon. So when Danny Huston started looking into Puglisi as a collector of movie and TV memorabilia, including the Maltese Falcon, he turned over the DB5 rock, and he became intrigued by this lingering mystery about the stolen car. So the documentary has evolved since then to be primarily about the DB5's theft. Now, part of his team's research included acquiring the police report from the theft, which I couldn't get back when I did my 2006 article. So they gave me a copy. And to correct the record and the misinformation in my 2006 article, it turns out there is no mention of skid marks or of the car possibly being loaded onto a plane. The security at the tiny airport was minimal. The police did not check airports within flying radius for landings that night. So basically what the insurance agent told me in 2006 was not true. And I have been the unwitting agent of misinformation for the last 18 years. But why he lied to me is unclear. He had seen this police report. He knew what was in this. He made that up. I don't know why. However, many other things are about to become a lot more clear when the documentary is released. It's called Snow Shadow, after the actual color of the missing star car. So for decades, the Goldfinger DB5's color was always called silver birch. But the tricked out star car, that first one, as you'll recall, was the first handmade DB5 prototype. It was loaned to Eon Productions before DB5s were actually in commercial production. So it was painted the DB4's color. Their silver gray color was called Snow Shadow. So the documentary researchers have developed in great detail all possible theories of what might have happened to the car. They physically investigated and tested every theory. They've interviewed every person still alive who had any involvement with the case, including the owner, Anthony Puglisi, who's still around. Robert Luongo died. He got sick not long after he won that court case. So they've interviewed Anthony Puglisi and the original detectives who investigated the theft, and they traveled to every relevant location, even some that are underwater. And while I don't want to give away all their discoveries, the primary filmmaker and researcher, Matthew Millen, started calling the DB5 Schrodinger's car, existing and not existing at the same time, or if you prefer, worthless and priceless simultaneously. Do you know that Schrodinger's cat, has anyone heard of that theory that Schrodinger's cat, a couple people? Well, I have to explain it because what he did is, I can't explain the whole thing. It's, Schrodinger's cat is like a paradox of quantum mechanics. Just suffice it to say that Schrodinger proposed a complicated quantum theory thought experiment involving a cat inside a box that is simultaneously alive and dead. I can't really explain it, but Schrodinger's car makes perfect sense in that light. It exists and not exists at the same time. It's worthless and priceless at the same time, in that if the car does exist, the owner can't sell it or show it or drive it, hence worthless. But at the moment it should be discovered, unveiled, or identified, it becomes priceless. So, in my interview for the documentary, I compared the stolen car to the Maltese Falcon statuette. Now don't worry, it's much easier to understand than Schrodinger's cat. In the movie Maltese Falcon, there's a mad race of competing interests to find a jewel-encrusted falcon statuette. So people are killed, lovers betrayed, lives ruined, and sorry, but after 83 years, there are no spoiler alerts. It turns out to be a fake. So like the Goldfinger DB5, the movie's Falcon is a Hollywood illusion. There were several statuettes made of different materials, none of them actually jewel encrusted. In the movie, it's covered with some kind of coating to cover up the jewels, so you know they're like trying to chip it away. Where are the jewels? So like the 4 DB5s with non-working gadgets, a few of the Falcon props have been sold for huge sums. Steve Wynn paid $4.1 million for one of these statuettes. Funny, he could have had a Goldfinger DB5 for that price. I think it's rather fitting that this guy, Anthony Puglisi, ended up with one of each of them, you know, the Goldfinger car and a Maltese Falcon statuette. So what does it really mean? I'm not even sure I can answer that. But for a moment, imagine this. What if Auric Goldfinger had succeeded in irradiating the world's gold supply? Would it have mattered? Did it occur to him that the world might just move on to trade in a different valuable commodity? Maybe Snow Shadow Aston Martin DB5s? So what is the hypnotic hold these vehicles, so often conflated into one, have on the psyche? It's not the ride, which Tom McCahill, the godfather of road tests, once described as having, quote, some of the handling characteristics of Grant's tomb. He drove this and did a review of it in the lead up to Thunderball. Terry Lobson of RM Auctions, the guy who had the most recent seat time in the Bondmobiles that they were selling in 2006, he said, you could feel some swagger in the rear, but it didn't matter. He said, I'm not a James Bond, he said, I'm not James Bond, but for one brief shining moment, I thought I was. Now Jim Grundy, the insurance agent, he had a different view. I don't understand how it draws a crowd, he said. I understand the intellectual pursuit, being the custodian of a car who cares for it until it's passed on to another custodian, but I don't understand the hyping of a car. So Dave Worrell, the guy who wrote the most famous car in the world book, he contends that one reason for the car's continued popularity is that its gadgets are plausible, not the exaggerated spoofs they became in later Bond films. So you might question his calling them plausible until you realize that the car's mechanical modifications are so intuitive that Bond never has to refer to the owner's manual, which I can testify is every guy's fantasy. So the DB5 mystique remains so powerful that in 2020, Aston Martin made 25 Goldfinger continuation cars, they call them, street legal replicas. These are a few of them. They're drivable with all the legal gadgets actually working, or non-lethal gadgets, not the lethal gadgets. The non-lethal gadgets actually work, the lethal ones are fakes. Okay. The handmade Bond cars cost about $3.4 million, which is cheaper than buying one of the squishy originals, so-called originals, and a lot more fun to drive. Aston Martin sold all of them. So if I had to pick just one reason that the DB5 still draws crowds today, it would be this: simple nostalgia for the days when men were men, women were girls, and one guy in a sports car could save the world. Now, of course, that world never existed, but it is, as Bogart famously said at the end of the movie, the stuff that dreams are made of. Thank you.
Different by design. Studebaker is, Studebaker is, Studebaker is.